So, for our last session of the day, I did not intend to make all of the pre-20th century stuff today and all the post-20th century stuff tomorrow, but it just worked out that way. So this is Carlos's day. This is what today is all about. It's all about the mercantilism fight. Yes. Giving our last presentation this afternoon is Mathew Frith from the University of New England, which is not in Boston. He is speaking on Alexander Hamilton, Tench Coxe, and the diversity of talents, a neglected argument in early American protectionist thought. Mathew, take it away.
Thanks very much, Scott. So as Scott mentioned, the topic of today's presentation is Alexander Hamilton, Tench Coxe, and the diversity of talents. This paper is currently under review, but if it comes to revisions, any suggestions made today, I can incorporate that into the article. And the other thing, I actually intend to write a follow-up article based on this, which explores how Hamilton and Coxe's followers picked up this argument and developed it further. And I'll touch on that more towards the end of the presentation. Okay, now I think it might be, I don't seem to be displaying.
I'll use the arrow. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Different arrows.
All good. Now, I think it might be best to start by giving a background to the key figures involved to make the rest of the discussion go more smoothly. So as the title suggests, the two main protagonists in this story is Alexander Hamilton and Tench Coxe, but there is also William Barton as well. Now, all three of these figures worked in the US Treasury Department during the Washington administration. So Alexander Hamilton was the first US Secretary of the Treasury. Tench Coxe was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, and William Barton was Chief Clerk of the Treasury. Now, during this time, Hamilton and Coxe co-authored a document, which I'm sure we'd all be aware of, known as the Report on Manufactures. So it is often just credited to Hamilton, but we do know from archival evidence that it was actually a joint effort of Hamilton and Coxe in writing the report. And this was communicated to Congress on the 5th of December, 1791. And it argued for both the economic independence, but also for the economic well-being of the United States, that it should develop manufacturing. Now, typically historians of economic thought have viewed the Report on Manufactures as important because it represents the first articulation of the infant industry argument. So this argument basically says that in order to allow infant industries to develop, it's necessary to provide temporary protection so that they can develop the economies of scale, technological know-how, and technological capabilities to stand up to competition with more advanced foreign competitors. However, in the report, there is an equally powerful argument, which is the focus of today's presentation, and this is the argument from the diversity of talents, aptitudes, and dispositions, or what I'll refer to as the diversity of talents argument. So I'll return to the role of Coxe and Barton later on in the presentation, but let's get into the argument itself. Okay. So the argument can be found on page 11 of the Report on Manufactures. So according to Hamilton, as to the furnishing greater scope of the diversity of talents and dispositions which discriminate men from one another, this is a much more powerful means of augmenting the fund of national industry than it may first sight appear. It is a just observation that the minds of the strongest and most active powers for their proper objects, so he's talking about industry here, fall below mediocrity and labour without effect if confined to uncongenial pursuit. It is hence to be inferred that the results of human exertion may be immensely increased by diversifying its objects. When all the different kinds of industry are obtained in the community, each individual can find his proper element and call into activity the whole vigour of his nature. There is in the genius of the people of this country a peculiar aptitude for mechanic improvements. It would operate as a forceful reason for giving opportunities to this species of talent by the propagation of manufactures. So here, Hamilton is arguing that every individual possesses unique talents, aptitudes, dispositions, and in order to allow individuals to actually exercise these unique talents, it's necessary to cultivate a diversity of industries. So this is one of the arguments presented in the report in favour of protectionism. So if you impose a broad system of protective measures, then you're cultivating this diversity of industries, and this creates scope for individuals to actually enter those industries and exercise those talents. And for Hamilton, this is necessary to maximise economic growth and prosperity. As Hamilton says, the minds of the most strongest and active powers fall below mediocrity if confined to uncongenial pursuits. So he's clearly indicating that if you don't have this diversity of industry, you're actually going to be suppressing economic growth. So this actually differs significantly from classical trade theory and even modern neoclassical takes on classical trade theory. If you look at both Adam Smith's theory of absolute advantage and David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, these theories argue that in order to maximise economic welfare, nations should specialise in a particular industry or narrow basket of industries. But here, Hamilton's actually arguing the exact opposite. Instead, you need to have economic diversification. Specialisation might make sense if you assume that everyone is identical, but when you take into account this diversity of talents, aptitudes and dispositions, specialisation is actually economically harmful because certain talents will remain dormant and unutilised. So that is basically the argument in a nutshell. Now, there is another reason why this argument is important, and it's important because it represents a challenge to the conventional narrative in the secondary literature concerning Hamilton's economic thought. So what you largely find in the secondary literature is this argument that Hamilton was basically adapting Smithian economics or repurposing Smithian economics to divergent policy outcomes. So I've listed the following sources which more or less affirm this view, and this also feeds into a broader narrative about American economic thought in general. And that's the narrative that early American economic thought was largely unoriginal. They were essentially adapting classical economics to protectionist conclusions. So this argument began all the way back with an article by Charles Franklin Dunbar. It was actually an article commissioned to celebrate the centennial of American independence, and it looked at American economic independence. Although Dunbar actually argued that there wasn't really any economic independence because he argued that American economic thought was largely unoriginal and it was largely just taking the ideas of the classicals and applying them to different practical concerns and practical questions. And this interpretation has largely persisted in the literature ever since, both in the Hamilton literature but also in the literature of his American protectionist followers that continue on Hamilton's tradition. And by the way, if you're interested in understanding why this argument is wrong, you should purchase my book when it comes out next year. Now, my book will provide a more general argument against this narrative, but this paper is more targeted towards this particular question of the diversity of talents. I see this as a microcosm of the broader divergence between the two traditions, between the British classical school and the American protectionist school. And I think it will become very apparent that Hamilton was operating under assumptions that are clearly not Smithian in nature, as we'll get to in the coming slides. Now, I should just clarify that I'm not arguing outright that Smith did not influence Hamilton. I think that he did. So, for instance, one of the arguments which Hamilton does give in favour of encouraging manufactures is that he thinks that manufacturing is more conducive to the division of labour. And as we know, that is very central to Smith's thinking. So it is clear that certain elements of Hamilton's thought is influenced by Smith. So I'm not outright denying a Smithian influence. What I take issue with is really this exaggeration of Smith's influence on Hamilton's thought, which has permeated the literature, and the idea that the American protectionist school was simply derivative of classical economics, but they just happened to support protective tariffs. Now, I don't want to dwell on the secondary literature for the sake of time, but I'm happy to unpack this more in the Q&A if anyone's interested. Okay, so this issue of the diversity of talents, in my view, is representative of the divergence between Hamilton and Smith, but also between the British classical school and the American protectionist school more generally. In short, Smith and Hamilton, they hold to opposing views of human nature. So we have the following quote from The Wealth of Nations. To quote Smith, the difference of natural talents in the difference of natural talents in different men is in reality much less than we are aware of, and the very different genius which appears to distinguish men of different professions is not upon many occasions so much the cause as the effect of the division of labour. The difference between the most dissimilar characters between a philosopher and a common street porter, for example, seems to arise not so much from nature. So here Smith is denying, or at the very least downplaying, natural differences in talent. He's making the case that differences in individuals is actually the result of experience, and in particular the result of the division of labour. So it isn't something that's innate to different individuals. By the way, I'm not the first to make this observation, by the way. There's been plenty of other scholars that have also argued that Adam Smith held to a blank slate view of human nature. That said, I was at a conference a couple of months ago, and there was a Smith scholar there who insinuated that I was cherry-picking Smith. So I went back and I reviewed Smith's writings, and what you find is that this is not an isolated occurrence. If you look at Smith's lectures on jurisprudence, he's affirming the exact same thing. So if you go to lectures on jurisprudence, Smith says that the disposition to barter is by no means founded upon different genius and talents. It is doubtful if there be any such difference at all. So again, here Smith is denying differences in talents and genius, natural differences in talents and genius. And then he goes on to say that the difference between a porter and a philosopher in the first 4 or 5 years of their life is, properly speaking, none at all. And among the savages, there is always the greatest uniformity of character. So he's basically saying that in a natural state, everyone is uniform. You don't have these natural differences in what appears to be talent. What appears to be these differences in natural talents is a product of the division of labour, according to Adam Smith. Okay. Now, I think what Smith's scholars would most likely point to argue against the position that I'm ascribing to Smith would be to look at Smith's chapter on wages. In fact, that Smith scholar that called me out referred to the chapter on wages. Now, Smith does mention talent and genius when he's talking about wages. However, in almost every instance of Smith talking about talent, he qualifies it by saying the likes of acquired, acquisition, acquiring. So I have the following selection of quotes from Smith's chapter on wages and also some other sections of The Wealth of Nations. In each of these cases, he's talking about the expense of acquiring talents, how talent is seldom acquired but through long application of time, and the acquisition of talents by the acquirer, which comes via education and so forth. Now, it seems to me that this usage of the term acquiring and acquired seems very much deliberate on the part of Adam Smith to indicate that what we think of as talent, which in the common usage refers to natural abilities or being naturally gifted in something, it's actually an acquired trait, according to Smith. So Smith is a thoughtful thinker, and it seems very evident what he's actually doing here to indicate this. Now, this is very different to what you find in Hamilton. Hamilton is very firm in the view that there is this diversity of natural talents, and so much so that in order to allow individuals to exercise their natural talents, then we need to cultivate a diversity of industries. All right, so just to summarise what I've said, Smith denies the existence of natural differences in individual characteristics. So labour is naturally homogeneous. Don't want to walk you away with the wrong conclusions. So Hamilton posits that there's an immense variety of difference in individual natural talents, dispositions and aptitudes. So for Hamilton, labour is not only highly heterogeneous, but also innately heterogeneous. So it isn't really the case that Hamilton is simply adapting Smithian economics to divergent policies. I mean, this is a matter of first principles, differing conceptions of human nature. It's axiomatic in nature. It's arguably one of the most fundamental things in economics, since economics concerns how individuals produce, distribute and exchange. So your conception of human nature matters significantly when dealing with economic questions. And you can also see from this how Smith therefore arrived at the conclusion of free trade. If labour is homogeneous, then labourers by their very nature cannot be locked into uncongenial pursuits. So nations should simply buy where cheapest, according to Smith, and if they specialise under freedom of trade, that's perfectly fine because individuals will acquire the abilities to be successful in whatever industry you might specialise in, since individual aptitudes are an acquired trait. But if you agree with Hamilton that individuals do indeed possess unique talents, then you want to allow this economic diversification through the likes of protective tariffs so that you can accommodate all the different talents which exist in the community. Otherwise, certain talents and abilities will go to waste. Now, in my opinion, this represents a far more powerful challenge to classical trade theory than the infant industry argument, and this comes despite the report on manufacturers being most associated with the infant industry arguments. Now, some of these points, they're more pointing out the contemporary relevance of this argument, but I think it's worth noting the contemporary relevance of this argument. So when it comes to the infant industry argument, the emphasis is on infant industry, so it seemingly only justifies the temporary use of protectionist policies to develop these infant industries. The other thing, and whilst this isn't exactly an argument that I subscribe to, I have seen other scholars argue that the argument for infant industries isn't necessarily inconsistent with comparative advantage and free trade in the long run. In the long run, you should still specialise according to the theory of absolute or comparative advantage. Now, personally, I don't think this argument really makes that much sense because comparative advantage, at least how it was initially put by Ricardo, it was based on static comparative costs based on natural resource endowments, whereas the infant industry argument's operating on something entirely different. It's looking at dynamic costs, but that's not an issue worth going into in this talk. And the other thing is that the infant industry argument is frequently dismissed as an exception to the general principle that nations should specialise into freedom of trade. If you look at mainstream texts on international trade theory, they tend to just brush aside the infant industry argument. They'll pay lip service to it, but it doesn't really undermine the broader argument in favour of specialising in the freedom of trade. Now, the diversity of talents argument challenges classical trade theory directly. First, if you take the diversity of talents argument seriously, it justifies maintaining a permanent system of protection to both develop and maintain a diversity of industries. So it's not just about temporary protection of infant industries. In fact, specialisation, as you would have under classical trade theory, is not a good thing according to this view, because if you specialise in a particular industry or narrow basket of industries, you're harming economic welfare since those talents will be laid dormant and go to waste, basically. And it's actually for this reason. If you actually look at the primary literature of the 19th century followers of Hamilton and Coxe, now they still use the infant industry argument, but by far the more common argument which they're actually using is this argument from the diversity of natural talents. And now this isn't just a historical debate with no bearing on modern scholarship. Modern Ricardian trade models, which are still used by economists today, they're based on the assumption of homogeneous labour. So this arguably provides a powerful argument against these modern trade theories as well. Okay, so we've looked at the significance of the argument and how it challenges the conventional narrative concerning Hamilton and economic thought more generally. But let's turn to the second and more central argument presented in my paper. And this relates to the origin of the argument itself. Now, it's important to recall from earlier the three key figures. So obviously there's Hamilton, but also Tench Coxe, who co-authored the report on manufacturers, and also William Barton, the chief clerk of the Treasury. We'll come to Barton in a bit, but let's just look at Coxe for a moment. Now, I was critical of the secondary literature earlier, but just to demonstrate that I have consistent standards, I'm actually going to critique myself here. So to quote my PhD, it should not be concluded, however, that Coxe influenced Hamilton, as Hamilton's first draft, which was written before Coxe's, also contains a reference to the diversity of human talents. Now, after doing some more research and re-examining the primary text, I now believe that I was incorrect, and I'm confident that Tench Coxe was indeed the architect behind the argument and that he influenced Hamilton. So my earlier views on this particular matter were incorrect. That said, so as to not undermine my own authority on the topic, I should clarify that that quote comes from an obscure footnote on page 266 of the thesis. I think overall the rest of the thesis still stands up to scrutiny. And we also have Carlos here, who was my examiner, and I think he can vouch for its quality. So,
Matthew, we all like you more for admitting your failures. You're in that kind of group.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Now, I might just quickly touch on this. So when looking at the role of Coxe in writing the report on manufactures, at least I get the sense that historically the literature has tended to downplay Coxe's involvement. There are kind of two main exceptions to this, and that's Bernard Mason and Jacob E. Cook. I also know Stephen Meerden's article, he also mentions Coxe as well, so I probably should have included him on the slide. Now, Mason wasn't particularly detailed, and it was more of a research note suggesting that Coxe may have played a role, but it doesn't really elaborate. However, Cook is really the key source who argued that Coxe played a more significant role in the report on manufactures. Now, what's actually interesting is much of the secondary literature, there has seemingly been this tendency to downplay or ignore the role of Coxe in writing the report on manufactures. And I almost get the sense that that if these sources were to concede Coxe's contribution, concede that Coxe did contribute in a meaningful way, that this would somehow diminish Hamilton's contribution. It seems kind of strange because the secondary literature is also perfectly willing to diminish Hamilton's originality by positing the heavy influence of Smith, when Coxe was undoubtedly more influential to writing the report on manufactures because he actually helped write the report. Anyway, that's just a feeling I get. I could actually be wrong about that. Maybe they had their own reasons for why they've ignored Coxe, or maybe they weren't really aware of the drafts and those sorts of things. But in any case, neither Mason or Cook discuss the diversity of talents argument in either of their accounts, so this is actually where my article comes in. Now, I should also say that in presenting this argument, I'm not trying to diminish the contribution of Hamilton, and I'm not suggesting that Coxe was the brains behind the report on manufactures. So my interpretation, having read the report on manufactures in the context of the broader corpus of Hamilton and Coxe's economic writings, is that it really was a fusion of the ideas of both Hamilton and Coxe. And just to demonstrate this, whilst I'm arguing that the diversity of talents argument does come from Coxe, many of the other arguments clearly come from Hamilton. The infant industry argument, for example, can be clearly traced to Hamilton. Now, whilst the secondary literature does typically cite the report on manufactures as the origins of the infant industry argument, this isn't strictly true. If you actually go to a decade prior to the infant industry argument, Hamilton wrote a series of essays called the Continentalist Papers, and it was in Continentalist number 5, to my knowledge, where Hamilton first expresses the infant industry argument. So we can safely conclude that this was Hamilton's contribution to the report. The other thing is the report also discusses the likes of taxation and those sorts of things, and Hamilton makes similar arguments to what he says in the report on manufactures in the Federalist Papers as well. So it seems pretty clear to me that there wasn't really one kind of intellect behind the report on manufactures. It was really a joint effort between Hamilton and Coxe. But with respect to this particular argument concerning natural talents, it seems very evident that it actually came from Coxe. Now, tracing the evolution of the argument is rather complicated, so I've created a timeline which should hopefully make it easier to understand the development of the argument. So this timeline illustrates the lead up to the final report on manufacturers. Now, there was a series of drafts of the report, which we'll get to, but I discovered that the first instance of this argument was not actually in the report or its drafts. It was actually an earlier tract written by Coxe, and this tract was written in 1789, so 2 to 3 years prior to the final report on manufacturers. So this tract was entitled Observations on the Agriculture, Manufactures and Commerce of the United States. So to quote Coxe, the creator and benefactor of man has in great wisdom and goodness so diversified the natural talents, genius and dispositions of mankind that they have a natural propensity and turn of mind to different occupations and employment. Husbandry, for example, is not preferred by everyone as an agreeable employment, nor entered into by those who have a natural propensity for some other occupation, if such could be found and entered into. So we have a very clear and explicit statement by Coxe. This isn't some vague allusion to the argument, it is effectively the argument. And as far as I can tell, this is the first time that this argument has ever appeared. I've tried to go back to the mercantilist literature to try and find this argument, and I haven't been able to find it. So this is the first instance of this argument. Now, just on Coxe's observations more broadly, on my flight over here, I read both the report on manufacturers and also Coxe's observations, and I actually think that Coxe's observations is probably his most impressive work when it comes to economic theory. So Coxe did write a number of books on political economy, but they tend to be these very dense descriptive tomes, and it's very hard to actually draw out his theoretical insights amongst all the description and detail in them. But in observation, he's focused on elucidating principles and ideas. Now, it's roughly the same size as the report on manufacturers, but I actually think it's an easier read than the report. However, this pamphlet has only received very limited attention by historians of American economic thought, even by the likes of Jacob E. Cook, who was the authority on Coxe. Anyway, so let's go back to the timeline and look at the different drafts of the report on manufacturers. Now, if you remember what I said on the earlier slide, I initially rejected the suggestion that Coxe came up with the idea because it actually featured in Hamilton's first draft and not in Coxe's first draft. So we have a first draft from Coxe, which isn't actually dated, but it seems to have been written in early 1790. Now, this draft doesn't feature the argument. It was in the next two drafts of the report on manufacturers where the argument appears. This was Hamilton's first draft and Coxe's second draft. And what you tend to find is that every subsequent draft of the report contains the argument from natural talents. But let's first look at both the drafts by Hamilton and Coxe that first contain the argument, and we'll come back to these other drafts in a moment. Okay, so this is a side-by-side comparison of the relevant passages, the relevant passage in both Hamilton's first draft and Coxe's second draft, Now, they're both virtually... That's okay, it wasn't what I needed. Now, they are both virtually identical aside from a few variations, so I'll just read from Coxe's draft, which is the cleaner version. When the variety of human talent is duly remembered and is considered that the minds of the strongest and most active powers for their proper object may fall below mediocrity and labour without effect if confined to uncongenial pursuits, it will appear unwise so as to arrange our political economy as to impel agriculture on the whole body of the people. It is interesting to the prosperity and advancement of the US that those who being procured qualified by nature for the useful arts should find the encouragement necessary to call forth their various talents. And there's a little bit more there as well. Now, if you look at Hamilton's draft, you'll see that there are some additions and deletions. Now, that's actually part of the text itself. If you go to the physical draft, words are crossed out, and there's also additions made in the margin of the manuscript. Now, there's something very unusual about Hamilton's first draft, particularly if you look at the dating. Hamilton's first draft appears before Coxe's draft, yet Coxe's draft appears to be the source material of Hamilton's draft. If Coxe's draft came later, we'd expect these additions to feature in Coxe's draft, and we'd also expect the crossed out words to be absent, but they're not. So just judging in terms of textual variation, you'd have to conclude that Coxe's draft is the source material for Hamilton's draft, but it doesn't make sense in terms of the chronology. It doesn't make sense that we have these additions and deletions in Hamilton's draft if it came before Coxe's draft. Now, there are some points to note. I mentioned on the last slide that there was an even earlier draft by Coxe. Now, even though that earlier draft doesn't actually feature the argument from the diversity of talents, something to keep in mind is that approximately a third of Hamilton's first draft, so this one featured up on the screen, roughly a third of Hamilton's draft is directly taken from Coxe's first draft. Now, something else that's very important to keep in mind is if you actually look at the original manuscripts, the third of Hamilton's first draft, which was adapted from Coxe's first draft, is not recorded in Hamilton's handwriting. It's actually recorded in the handwriting of William Barton, who was the chief clerk in the Treasury. So it was Barton's transcription of Coxe's draft, which was added to Hamilton's first draft on the Report on Manufactures. Now, the rest of the draft is mostly in Hamilton's handwriting, but there are several additional pages which are neither derived from Coxe's first draft, nor are they recorded in Hamilton's handwriting. These additional pages are also written in Barton's handwriting. Now, it's actually in these additional pages that the passage up on the screen appears. So this passage is in the additional pages which have been transcribed by William Barton. So how do we make sense of this? We have a portion of Hamilton's first draft here, which is not written by Hamilton. It's not recorded in his handwriting, but we know that a significant amount of Hamilton's draft is transcribed by Barton from an earlier draft from Tench Coxe, and we also know that Coxe's second draft contains the argument from the diversity of talents, and it appears to be the source material for the passage appearing in Hamilton's first draft. And we also know that Coxe had already expressed the argument earlier, back in 1789. And I've also read a lot of Hamilton, and I've never seen Hamilton express this argument from the diversity of talents. Now, it seems to me that the most likely scenario is that there was actually a lost intermediate draft between Coxe's first draft and his second draft. Now, I admit that this is somewhat speculative because we don't have any recording of this intermediate draft, but I don't think it's really all that far-fetched. It's very easy for a document like this to be lost over the course of history, but this explanation would explain the anachronisms in the textual variations. Our current understanding is anachronistic. It doesn't explain why the original source material is contained in a draft which is dated later than Hamilton's draft. But a lost intermediate draft by Coxe would actually explain this timeline. We also know that the majority of the text in Barton's handwriting was transcribed from material originally written by Coxe, so it stands to reason that those additional pages of text also recorded in Barton's handwriting also came from Coxe. So it seems to me that what happened is that Coxe's observations and his first draft informed this intermediate draft, and that went on to influence both Coxe's second draft because it contains the original source material, and also Hamilton's first draft. And then it would eventually make it into the final report on manufactures. Now, of course, I recognise that some might be sceptical because we don't actually have this hypothetical draft, That said, my argument doesn't hinge on whether or not this lost draft exists or not. Even if we dismiss the intermediate draft hypothesis, there are alternate explanations for why the argument originated with Coxe. We already have definitive proof that Coxe was the first to come up with this argument in his 1789 tract, but there is another explanation which would solve this textual variation issue. So when you actually look at the physical drafts of the report, there's no specific date recorded. So I'm referring to Coxe's second draft and Hamilton's first draft. The only thing recorded in terms of dating is actually the year 1790. Those dates which were assigned to both drafts were assigned by the editors of the collected works of Alexander Hamilton, and the editors say that the dating was based off internal evidence. Now, they don't actually specify what this internal evidence is, so it kind of is anyone's guess, but it's certainly plausible at least that the editors may have been mistaken with the dating of these different drafts of the report on manufacturers. They say internal evidence, but if we rule out the intermediate draft hypothesis, by the way, just my feeling is I think that probably is the most likely scenario, but let's just say we rule it out. If we're weighing up both this internal evidence, which we can't judge the veracity of, versus direct textual evidence, which is actually the drafts themselves, then you really have to lean more on the side of the direct textual evidence, since we can't judge the veracity of what this internal evidence was. And so, yeah, if we rule out this hypothetical draft, this intermediate draft, it seems to me that there could be an error in the dating of the drafts of the report on manufacturers, and that Coxe's draft could well have been written earlier, and this would explain the issue with the textual variations, the fact that Coxe's second draft seemed to be the source material for Hamilton's first draft. So again, my hypothesis is that there is my hypothesis is that there probably was an intermediate draft. But if we rule that out, there are alternative explanations to explain how the argument still originally came from Coxe with respect to the report on manufacturers. It is much harder, however, to accept the view that the argument came from Hamilton. It doesn't explain the anachronisms in the text, and we also have definitive proof that Coxe had already expressed this argument back in his observations. So even though we can't establish with complete certainty, this is often the case with matters such as this, I still think, I'm of the opinion that I'm confident that I can still safely conclude that Coxe was indeed the architect behind this argument. Now, the other thing which I should have made more explicit in the paper itself is that if you accept the full logic of this argument, then it lends itself to imposing tariffs on conceivably all kinds of goods. However, what you tend to find with Hamilton is he tends to be more pragmatic when it comes to imposing tariffs. So Hamilton argues, for example, that you should actually lower tariffs on the likes of agricultural inputs in manufacturing because you don't want to pass those additional costs on to manufacturing. However, Tench Coxe, his approach is more principled in a way, especially in light of this argument. So Coxe supports levying tariffs on virtually every kind of good, including agricultural goods. So it seems to me that Coxe's approach to tariffs is also more consistent with the underlying logic of the argument that we should have maximum diversification. So this also lends further support to the idea that this was Coxe's contribution to the report on manufacturers, because his approach is more consistent with the argument itself. Okay. So this causes us to reevaluate the history of American economic thought. So as I mentioned, the standard depiction is that it was basically, it all came from Adam Smith. It was Adam Smith who shaped and influenced American economic thought. And this has, in my view, unfairly diminished the likes of Tench Coxe and more novel and original contributions made by early American economists. So certainly Coxe in my view, influenced Hamilton, but we can also see Coxe influencing later American protectionist thinkers throughout the 19th century. Now, there were two major hubs of protectionist thought in 19th century America. The first was Philadelphia, which was arguably the most important. So Coxe lived in Philadelphia, and eventually after the death of Hamilton, a figure called Mathew A, he would become the de facto leader of the protectionist movement. Now, he was friends with Tench Coxe. Both of them were members of the Philadelphia Society for the Promotion of Peaceful Manufactures, so they were well acquainted with one another. Now, Mathew Carey's son, Henry Charles Carey, would eventually become the thought leader of American protectionism in the mid-19th century. He was very influential. He was probably one of the most important economists in the United States at the time. And what you find is that Carey is echoing the argument originally put forth by Coxe. So to quote Carey, each rat, robin, fox and wolf is a type of his species wherever found, possessing habits and instincts in common, but such is not the case in man, in whom we find differences of taste, feelings and capacities, almost as numerous as those observed in human countenance. So there appears to be a line of influence from Coxe through the elder Carey into the younger Carey. Now, the other hub of protectionist thought was Boston, and what you find is this argument also emerges among the Boston protectionists as well. So Daniel Webster was a prominent Whig statesman, the Whigs being the predecessor of the Republican Party, and you have Webster saying, why is the protection to domestic labour useful and necessary to the country? When it comes to this, we have a variety of occupations, and allow me to say that this variety of occupations is a matter of great importance to society, for it gives full scope to every degree of ingenuity and talent. Now, all of these thinkers would have been well aware of the report on manufactures, so they likely obtained it directly from the report. But you even have Webster citing other works written by Tench Coxe, so he was familiar with the broader corpus of Tench Coxe's writings. So I think this causes us to reassess the history of American economic thought and give Tench Coxe greater recognition. So the secondary literature, as I mentioned, places a lot of emphasis on Adam Smith shaping American economic thought and basically dismisses American contributions as derivative, but this seems to be a clear case of a novel American contribution to the history of economic thought. Now, I mentioned at the start that I eventually want to trace the development of this idea from Hamilton and Coxe through to their 19th century followers, at least more so than what I do in the present paper. Now, in terms of initial impressions, what you find, at least in my view, is that both the British classical school and the American protectionists, their views became more exaggerated compared to both the likes of Hamilton and also the likes of Adam Smith. Now, just to explain what I mean by this, what you had under Smith was a rejection of natural differences, yet he still accepted the existence of acquired traits, so traits that arise from the division of labour. However, what you get under Ricardo is labour is basically just a homogeneous and undifferentiated input in production, so a unit of labour is simply a unit of labour. And of course, there's much more of an emphasis on international specialisation in David Ricardo as well. Now, I think the exaggeration is less pronounced on the side of the protectionists. The degrees of separation between Hamilton and Coxe and the 19th century followers is much less than the changes on the side of the classicals. However, there is still an emphasis, a difference in emphasis. Now, the main difference is that Hamilton Coxe largely views the accommodation of the diversity of talents as a means to an end, namely the promotion of economic wealth. If you recall from the first slide, Hamilton says that accommodating this diversity of talents is a powerful means of augmenting the fund of national industry. So he kind of views it as a means to an end. What you get in Hamilton and Coxe's followers, including the likes of Henry Carey and others, is that this accommodating of the diversity of talents is both a means and an end in itself. So later protectionists put a lot of emphasis on promoting individuality, and they see this as intimately connected with the diversity of talents, aptitudes, and dispositions. So the more that you can accommodate this diversity of talents, the more you can promote individuality. So it's much deeper than the initial argument under Coxe and Hamilton. It's a worthy goal in itself because it means that individuals have more meaningful employment and also more meaningful lives. So I think one of the best expositions of this argument actually comes from Rufus Coate, who was also another Whig statesman. So Coate says that a diversified, advanced and refined mechanical and manufacturing industry, cooperating with other numerous employments of civilization which surrounds it, offers the widest choice, it detects the slightest shades of individuality, quickens into existence and trains into perfection the largest conceivable and utmost possible variety of national mind. Every fragment of the mind is gathered up, nothing is lost, every taste, every faculty, every peculiarity of mental power finds its task, does it, and is made the better for it. Now from this quote, and also looking at the fuller context of the article by Coate, there is an explicit emphasis on promoting individuality, and this is viewed as a good thing in itself. However, I think an even better indication of this changing emphasis is actually looking at Henry Carey. Sorry, I went too far. Now, to briefly give some context to make this quote make sense, Henry Carey became fed up in the mid-19th century with the term political economy. He took issue with the term political economy. He took issue with political economy, viewing man too much in connection with just material wants. And he also thought that political economy was too associated with Ricardian economics. So he ended up dropping the term political economy and he started using the term social science to describe his approach. Now, just as a side note, even though Henry Carey dropped the term political economy, most of his followers still kept using the term political economy. In any event, Henry Carey ended up coming up with his own definition of social science, and he defines it as the science that treats man in his efforts for the maintenance and improvement of his conditions, and may be defined as the science of the laws which govern man in his efforts to secure for himself the highest individuality and the greatest power of association with his fellow man. So even in Carey's definition of his own discipline, we find this concept of individuality as central. So this emphasis on the diversity of talents becomes much more of a centerpiece among Hamilton and Coxe's followers than what it was under Hamilton and Coxe themselves. And you can also see this just by comparing their writings. You do have to go searching for it in the writings of Hamilton and Coxe to actually find this argument for the diversity of natural talents. Yet, when you go to Carey, he's constantly talking about promoting individuality and those sorts of things. Anyway, I might leave it there, and I'm happy to get your thoughts on all of this. So thank you very much.
Well,